right, everyone, get ready, because today we're diving deep into evidence-based practice in mental health. And we're not just scratching the surface here, we're going way beyond simple definitions, talking about its fascinating history, those tricky controversies, and how you can put all this knowledge into practice to really make the best decisions for your patients.
It's about becoming comfortable, with those gray areas where the research, your experience, and each patient's unique needs all kind of come together.
I love that. Comfortable with the gray areas. I feel like that's where the really interesting stuff happens, right? But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. What is evidence-based practice, or EBP, in mental health? I've got the official definition right here. It says EBP is the integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. Well, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Maybe a little formal. How would you explain it to someone who's totally new to the idea of EBP?
You got to lose the jargon, that's for sure. Picture this. You're building a treatment plan. You wouldn't just rely on one single blueprint, right? You'd think about the landscape, what materials you've got, and probably most important, what the person you're building it for actually wants, their vision. EBP is kind of that same thoughtful approach, just applied to mental health care.
So it's about combining the best research out there, your own clinical experience, and each patient's unique story all together. Kind of like a three-legged stool. It needs all three legs to stand up strong.
That's it. And it's interesting how this whole approach came about, because there was a time when mental health care wasn't always so, evidence-based. We relied a lot on theories or the influence of big names in the field instead of hard research.
Wow, yeah. That's a pretty big difference. Makes you appreciate how far we've come in demanding solid evidence.
For sure. I mean, it's not to say those older approaches were all bad or anything, but the move towards using real data to shape treatments, that was a game changer.
Definitely. Okay, so let's break down these three legs of EBP. We've got the research, the clinician's expertise, and the patient as an individual. Let's start with the best available research part. Sounds kind of obvious, but I'm guessing it's a bit more complicated than just, Googling a diagnosis, right?
You're right. Not all research is equal. We're looking for research that's clinically relevant, meaning it directly applies to what you're doing day to day with your patients. And even then, you've got different levels of evidence. Imagine it like a pyramid right at the top. You've got the gold standard, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs for short.
RCTs, right. Those are the studies where they randomly assign people to groups. One gets the new therapy, another maybe gets a different therapy or a placebo, right?
Exactly. The great thing about RCTs is that they're designed to really isolate the effects of a treatment and minimize bias. But, and it's a big but, while they're great for studying things like medications, they don't always translate perfectly to the world of mental health.
Right, because you can't really standardize something as complex as therapy the same way you can with a medication. Each person's experience, the relationship with the therapist, it's so unique.
That's it. And that's where the other levels of the evidence pyramid come in. We're talking about things like systematic reviews, meta-analyses. They're like super studies. They pull information from a bunch of different studies to give us a more well-rounded perspective.
So if RCTs are sitting at the top of this pyramid, what's below them? Like, how do I know what other research I can really trust?
Great question. So below RCTs, you've got things like cohort studies, case control studies, case series, that kind of thing. Now, they don't carry quite the same weight as those RCTs because they can be more prone to bias, but they can still give us some valuable insights, especially when doing an RCT just isn't feasible or ethical, depending on what you're looking at.
Okay, yeah, I see. It's about recognizing what each type of research can tell us and what its limitations are. And speaking of limitations, something I see come up a lot is what happens when there's not much research on a specific topic, or the research we do have doesn't really apply to my patient population? I think we should definitely dig into that a little bit more right after we take a quick break. And we're back, ready to tackle the trickier side of evidence-based practice. Those times when the research is pretty limited, or maybe it doesn't quite fit the person sitting right there in front of you.
It's like we were talking about before, those gray areas. It's where that three-legged stool analogy, remember? It can get a bit wobbly. But don't worry, we can definitely find ways to keep things steady.
Okay, good. I'm all about stability, so give me those tips. What do we do when the research is lacking, or maybe just doesn't quite line up with a particular patient?
So this is where the clinician expertise part of our stool, that leg, gets really important. It's about using all that experience you've built up over the years, what you've learned from similar cases, your understanding of different therapies, and yeah, even your intuition, that gut feeling you develop after working with people for a while.
So it's not that we completely ignore the research, but we accept that it might not have every single answer, right?
Right. Think of it this way. Research can give us a roadmap, but sometimes we need to go off-road a little to get where we need to go. That's where clinical judgment comes in. It helps us navigate when we're in uncharted territory.
Okay, I like that analogy. But clinical judgment, I mean, it sounds a little vague. What does that look like in practice? How do I explain to a patient, hey, I'm kind of going with my gut on this one?
It's not so much about blindly following a gut feeling. It's more about using all your knowledge and experience to make good decisions, even when the research isn't totally clear. Let's say you have a patient with a really unusual combination of symptoms, something that doesn't fit neatly into any diagnosis. The research on treating that exact situation, it might be pretty limited, but you can use your knowledge about each individual symptom, your experience with similar cases, to figure out a treatment plan.
So it's like, what's a good analogy? Oh, it's like being a detective, you're putting together clues from all these different places to try and solve the case, even if you don't have a clear suspect right away.
Perfect analogy. And it's so important to be open with your patients during this whole process. Let them know you're figuring things out together, that you're going to listen to their feedback and adjust as you go along.
Because it's a team effort, right? Not like a one-sided thing.
Exactly. The patient's preferences, what they value, their cultural background, those are all important factors too. We want to find a treatment that aligns with their worldview, something that feels like a good fit for them personally.
Right, that makes sense. Which brings us back to that third leg of the stool, the patient as a whole person. And this is where things can get really interesting, ethically complex even, right? What happens when a patient's preference clashes with the research? Or maybe even with our own judgment as clinicians?
You've hit on one of the most interesting and challenging parts of EBP, balancing a patient's right to make their own choices with our responsibility to give them the best possible care. It's tricky sometimes.
Okay, let's say there's a therapy that's strongly supported by research, but the patient has some reservations, maybe because of their cultural beliefs or past experiences. How do we approach that situation?
It really comes down to good communication. We need to acknowledge and respect their perspective, but also make sure they have all the information to make an educated decision. It might mean explaining the research in a way they understand, really digging into their concerns, and then working together to weigh the pros and cons of different options.
And sometimes that means finding a compromise or a different approach that feels more in line with their values, right?
Exactly. Maybe they're open to a modified version of the therapy, or maybe there's a different approach that has some research support and sits better with them. It's about being flexible and creative and always, always putting that therapeutic relationship and shared decision-making first.
It seems like these tricky situations where those EBP pillars don't perfectly align, they're more common than we realize.
Way more common. And this is where those visuals you mentioned earlier can be super helpful. Remember those overlapping circles that represent the 3 pillars of EBP?
Oh, right. Those were in chapter 8, I think. Yeah, those diagrams showing how sometimes the circles, research expertise, patient, they overlap perfectly, but often they just kind of intersect in different ways.
Exactly. Those visuals really show how much those pillars depend on each other. Sometimes it's a perfect overlap, you get that textbook EBP decision, but often it's more like a partial overlap, and we need to think carefully about the context to make the best choice.
It's almost like a dance, isn't it? Trying to get the research, your expertise, and the patient's journey to all flow together.
Love that analogy. And just like a good dance partner, we have to be adaptable, pay attention, and really be aware of what's happening in each moment.
Speaking of nuances, let's talk about the numbers, the statistics that come with research. It's easy to get caught up in whether something is statistically significant. But how do we make sure we're focusing on what's actually going to make a difference for our patients?
That is such a crucial question. And it leads us to the concept of clinical significance, which is a total game changer.
All right, so we're back, ready to dig into this idea of clinical significance. Because those research articles, let's be real, they can feel like a foreign language sometimes. All those p-values and confidence intervals. How do we make sure those numbers actually translate into something meaningful for our patients? Something that makes a real difference in their lives?
That's the million-dollar question. It's really easy to get caught up in statistical significance, right? Like, oh, this study showed a statistically significant decrease in anxiety. But here's the thing. Just because something is statistically significant doesn't always mean it's actually significant in real life.
So you're saying something can be a big deal statistically, but not really change anything about how someone feels or functions day to day.
Exactly. That's where clinical significance comes in. It's about asking, okay, the numbers moved a bit, but did it really make a difference for this person? Did anything actually change? Think about a therapy, for example, that's proven to reduce social anxiety, statistically speaking. But what if it only reduces anxiety scores by a tiny bit? Like, the person still gets really anxious in social situations, still avoids parties, still feels that tightness in their chest when they walk into a crowded room. Statistically, yeah, there's a change. But clinically, not really.
Right. Like they say, the difference is statistically significant, but not practically significant.
Exactly. And that's why we can't just blindly follow the numbers. We have to look beyond that at those more qualitative changes, how those numbers translate into a person's actual experience. Are they sleeping better? Are their relationships improving? Are they more engaged in life? Those are the things that tell us if something is clinically significant.
So how do we measure that? I mean, it seems a lot less straightforward than just looking at numbers and graphs.
It definitely requires a more well-rounded approach. It's not just about tracking symptom changes. It's about looking at the bigger picture, how well someone is functioning, their overall quality of life, their sense of well-being. We can use standardized measures that capture those broader aspects of a person's experience.
And it takes a lot of communication with the patient too, right? Regularly checking in, asking those open-ended questions. How are you feeling? What's working? What's not working?
Absolutely. It has to be collaborative, just like every other part of EBP. And this is where that therapeutic alliance, that strong, trusting relationship, it becomes even more essential.
Yeah.
When you have that kind of connection with your patients, you're much more likely to get a clear and accurate picture of how a treatment is really affecting them.
And you're in a better position to adjust things as needed. It's that constant evaluation, that willingness to adapt and refine the approach, right? That dynamic process you were talking about earlier.
Exactly. It's not about finding one answer and sticking with it no matter what. It's about staying curious, staying present, and being open to the possibility that what works in one moment might need to be tweaked or even completely changed down the line.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into evidence-based practice, what are some key things you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
I think the most important thing to remember is that EBP is not about blindly following research. It's about using the best available evidence to guide your decisions, yes, but always while considering your own clinical judgment and, most importantly, the individual needs, preferences, and values of each patient.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where the research, your expertise, and the patient as a whole person all come together.
Exactly. And don't shy away from those gray areas, those situations where the answers aren't always clear-cut. Embrace the complexity, stay curious, and never underestimate the importance of open communication and shared decision-making.
Because ultimately, it's about empowering our patients, helping them live healthier, more fulfilling lives.
Absolutely. And sometimes that means looking beyond the numbers, trusting our instincts, our experience, and all those intangible but incredibly important factors that make each therapeutic journey unique.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of evidence-based practice.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, EBP is a journey, not a destination. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to provide the most compassionate and effective care you can.
And to all our listeners out there, we want to hear from you. How do you incorporate evidence-based practices into your own work? What are some challenges you face? And what successes have you had in bridging the gap between research and real-world practice? Share your thoughts with us on our website, social media, wherever you like to connect with us. Until next time, keep diving deep.